بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحابته أجمعين اللهم افتح علينا كل العارفين وحقنا من الصالحين واجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول ويتبعون أحسنه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for your punctuality today. We are so it's my famous line when I start any lecture with Muslims is thank you. So yesterday I was obviously talking about a number of issues. The most important, I think, was the issue of identity. I think we coalesced around that area of identity, what identity is, and why it's such an important issue in terms of the challenges that we face. Identity goes and cuts across a number of issues that we need to keep in mind. And it's also important, I was speaking to my wife about, I've got a couple of daughters and they read a lot of fairy tales. And she was saying that, one of my daughters used to always say, like, when are my eyes turning blue? When is my hair turning blonde? And it was as if the narrative that we'd given her in terms of identity of what she was consuming at school or what she was consuming in terms of the literature that's out there, she expected that to be projected in herself at some point until you introduce alternative identities, an identity that's authentic to the person. I think that resonates in a number of ways because of the fact that we ourselves are also of that nature. Even as adults, we're presented identities, and what I was talking about yesterday was that the West has jettisoned any essentialist view about what identity is. They don't have a core identity, so their identity is very much defined by what Muslims or Islam is. That identity that they project upon Muslims is very much a myth. So if you see what I mean, what you're being told about your identity, if you kind of take it up, is a projection of somebody else's desire for you to take up a specific identity. So it's very important. That was a very important point, I think, yesterday that was kind of covered. And the other thing is about the age we live in. Even though the presentation I'm going to do today is very much about ideas and theories, we live in terms of the public sphere in an age of feeling. And I was doing some research a couple of months ago on marketing, and I came up to this website, B2B, and the person who's writing, I think Christopher Baker, he was telling people how to market, and he was saying basically that to market you have to hit the ignition points, and you have to make people feel that they want to change, not through reason but through feeling, and you have to create the ignition points. And so that's how marketing works. And he says something essential in what makes us human has changed. So obviously at a certain point you wanted to sell something, you would say this thing is better than this thing because of these statistical things and all that. But now it's not, it's more about you want to buy into something, you want to buy into a lifestyle, you want to be projected as a specific type of person. And that also falls into the realm of ideas. Now ideas are not important, the important thing is that the idea makes you feel good about yourself. And that ties into this idea of individualism. So today's session, when I was thinking about it, I'm going to go over one aspect of that individualism, which is how it interacts or interfaces with gender. And to understand this, we're going to go through some kind of discussion about theories. So just a quick overview of a couple of theories to show you that the theories themselves are consuming themselves. Regardless of what Muslims believe in anything, they're eating themselves. It's almost like a state of cannibalism, like a kind of ideology which is cannibalized to the point it destroys itself. So I've entitled this Individualism, the Rise of Self-Identification, because these kind of themes will come up as we go along. But I want to start off with what I ended up with yesterday. Ashish Nandy, he's a very famous Indian intellectual, I think named amongst the top 100 public intellectuals in the world by the Forbes magazine. And what he mentioned, what I quoted yesterday, is actually very important because within this struggle of ideas, we shouldn't assume that a society that says it's tolerant, it will remain tolerant. Okay, that's very important. We always assume and we hope, and our assumption moves into hope that the society within which we operate is a tolerant society. I think what will become clear, especially in the discussions on, if you've been following the Conservative Party leadership campaign and the kind of 5 to 8 people who are in the campaign outdoing themselves to specifically target Muslims as being in some way the fifth column and to be seen as being hard on the Muslim minority. He says all cultures exclude even those associated with humanism and progress, so even the ones that we want to be on our side, and even those dedicated to tolerance, dialogue, and plurality. So there's a limit to plurality, there's a limit to all these ideas, which is important to keep in mind. So what I'm going to look at, inshallah, today is gender theory. And this is really to get you to the point where you understand that it doesn't matter how logical your point is, how much you can back up through statistical analysis, through data analysis, through peer-reviewed articles, through research, through academia. That is irrelevant if it clashes with feeling and this idea of the age of feeling. If your research or your conclusions or your peer-reviewed article comes into contact or conflict with what people feel, and especially a very specific class of privileged people, what they feel, it's going to come out second best in all situations. And there's no, I've not seen any situation where it's been allowed to stand. You will not win. And so the reason for that is going to come up when we look at the waves of feminism. The reason I'm looking at feminism is feminism is the starting point for the kind of discussions around the public consumption of what gender is at this moment in time. So the waves of feminism are very important. Some of them we recognize and we acknowledge and actually we support. But feminism has gone through numerous metamorphoses through its very, I would say not a long history, but the last two centuries. The most well-known is obviously the movement by the suffragettes, who looked for political suffrage and wanted voting rights, even things like property rights. I mean, if you look at European history, very recent, and look at France, look at Netherlands, you look at the women's right to own property, and just basic rights, you'll be shocked. You will be really shocked in terms of when basic rights that we would assume were given were not given. And this is what I was kind of intonating yesterday when Bernard Lewis was saying that Islam is anti-democratic, and he was taking Islamic history as being a representation of how anti-democratic it was. When were women given the right to vote? I mean, he's over 100, I think he's still alive, and he's over 100 years old. I think last year he turned 100. His memory is long enough to know a time, and he was alive at a time when women in the West did not have a right to vote. So I think our enemies are very selective in that myth that they create. They're very selective. I talked about the myth of Vienna yesterday as well. They're very selective in the way they read history as well. So the first wave was very much about real injustice, real marginalization of women. But then you get different waves. That you get some kind of conclusion on the suffragette question, some kind of conclusion on the issue of ownership, but there's still niggling imbalances within Western society in terms of balance between the genders. And that leads to, in the 60s and 70s, another wave of feminism, which is the second wave is broken up into a number of different waves, different approaches to this question. Most of them are coming down to the idea that there's still systemic issues within Western society that need to be addressed. One of them is liberal feminism, basically looking at the fact that women are projected with a mystique. So Betty Friedan, she talks about the idea that women are very much trying to live up to this kind of myth that women are only of utility within the family unit. And that's the mystique that they have as well, that they have to operate within that system. She's trying to break away from that. So she's challenging that idea that women are only good for homemaking and childbearing. And obviously, if you give her the benefit of the doubt, it's because of the fact that you have very systemic kind of processes within American society that are very much suffocating women anyway. So a lot of these theories come out of the experience of Western people. And she says we possess the same capabilities, but these abilities have been socialized and educated out. And this is not a very radical form of feminism. It's not really challenging anything. Germaine Greer, who's probably more famous, she said that women are given submissive roles in society to fill male perceptions of what being a woman entails. So this, deep down, you'd imagine if you're a woman and living at that time, you would see how society is moving. You look at the makeup of parliament, you look at the makeup of major companies, and you see the power structures. I find it very difficult not to agree with these kind of sentiments. The thing is that when we look at gender theory, there's a lot there that Muslims, it should resonate with Muslims. But there's also, obviously our kind of checks on it are very much represented by certain criticisms like functionalism, which is talking about the fact that society, if it's done properly and if you give equal access to people manifesting their abilities, then there's a functionalism within different genders having specific gender roles. So you have that kind of kickback, even in the 70s, to the kind of liberal feminist movement. But where things get interesting is when you have the kind of radical feminists coming in, which is, again, is within the second wave in the 70s mostly. Gail Rubin, she talks about the fact that this concept of patriarchy, which we use a lot nowadays, patriarchy, it's there and it's used, and it's an idea of the structural control of men. So that word gains provenance, gains currency at that specific time. And it's what it does, it starts to theorize the oppression of women. In other words, you have a theory about it, which is patriarchy. And so we're like, look at that picture. If I had a hammer, I'd smash patriarchy. She says, I found it. And basically, when you find it, you should smash it. I mean, it's this idea that you found the thing that is oppressing you. It's a structure, and you need to now then interact with that and basically change it. And what she also talks about is that every single structure, and this is leading into postmodernism I talked about yesterday, every structure is a tyranny. Every structure that a woman will find herself in will be a tyranny. Heterosexuality, and this is where, kind of the thing I'm going to talk about a bit later on comes in. Even heterosexuality, the fact that the family unit is made of a male and a female, is a structural tyranny. Traditional family is a structural, like marriage, in other words, is a structural tyranny. It needs to be destroyed and built up from the bottom. And so her basic idea is that she needs to deconstruct gender, but not biology. You probably won't pick up on what that means yet, but I put it in bold because of the fact that there will be people that will deconstruct biological significations of what gender we assume you to be. So in the 70s, we're still in a situation where we recognize that's a male, that's a female, because of the genitalia, basically. That's how we identify. So now there's a whole discussion about identified at birth as, so they have a whole discussion about should we even say that about children when they're born, that we try and identify them. It's an interesting thing. So it won't make sense until you go into the theory of it. So she deconstructs gender, meaning that gender is a tyranny. We need to deconstruct it. So we just need to be the same. We need to neutralize the existence of gender within the public space. Because structures are based upon, basic patriarchal structures are based upon identification of gender. And then we go into what I was talking about yesterday, which I think is the big wave, which is postmodernism, leads to individualism. It's very important that you understand what postmodernism is. There's this cartoon here, it says, on the one side there's an artist saying, I'm a genius. He's acknowledging that there is such a thing as a genius, as a category. He associates himself with that category, so he's a genius. And then in postmodernism, that same artist will deconstruct his own statement that I'm a genius. And he will say, the category of genius is a theoretical, untenable cultural construct. But in his mind, essentially, his ego, his nafs is still saying, I'm a genius. So it's mind games. I mean, it's interesting because a person will be of a specific gender and their mind deep down will tell them they're of a gender, but they will deconstruct the fact they're from a specific gender. That's postmodernism. And postmodernism is best represented in terms of its manifestation in gender theory in this statement of de Beauvoir, who says, one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one. Now, I know if you read that and you read it on your Instagram or your Facebook, you would share that. Because if you read it in a certain way, it makes perfect sense until I explain it to you. And what is interesting is that when she said it, I don't think she understood the dual connotations of what we understand now. One is not born a woman, but rather one becomes one. In other words, we would understand it as you grow into being a mature, fulfilled human being and individual. So that's very, very important that we understand that. But what she's actually saying is that the category of woman has been inflicted upon us by violence, by society. You're made one. Even though she's saying become, we think becoming is this process. That's not what she means. She means that you're shackled into this system where you are categorized as being a woman. That's postmodernism, because the category of woman is constructed for tyranny. So it's moving off from the second wave of feminism to the third wave. And so essentially they're deconstructionists. They basically want to deconstruct every single category that we have. That means truth, falsehood, everything is up open for discussion. They reject universal narratives, so they destruct the idea of woman, even gender, but more importantly, biology and anatomy as well. So even the physical traits and the physical things that society's always identified the different genders by, she will say that the identification of that specific genitalia is through a social construct. You really need to let that sink in, because it takes a lot of time to get your head around this area of gender theory. So the actual anatomy and the biological indicators are read as in a constructed way. Okay, so then you're categorized as being a specific thing. The point is here that will be used most famously by Judith Butler, who wrote, this is a book actually I saw in Turkey when I was in Turkey. It was translated, because I lived with students from Bosphorus University, and they were all, it was an English university, so they used to translate while at university, all the most recent books in English on philosophy and literature. That's how they would sustain themselves at university. So this is the kind of book they used to translate, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. So she has this, it's a fascinating idea that she has, but she is at the forefront of what are presented as being the thought leaders of civilization now. We're talking about that level where she is a megastar in terms of her reach, in terms of people that make decisions, like in the UN, cultural bodies that make decisions. And so what she starts to say is that if gender does not follow automatically from the sex act, they're not just two genders. She's basically talking about the fact that gender is a construction which has nothing to do with what you use your genitalia for in terms of intercourse. Gender is basically how you perform at a specific time, and your performance can be, if you give a kind of percentage of 0 to 100, because on some days you have a good day and a bad day, and the spread of gender is a construct. There's basically no gender, and so you're fluidly moving between different nuances of your being in terms of sexuality. Yes, I did say exactly what I said, and I was thinking of what I was saying as I was saying it. So that's my articulation of what she's saying to make it understand. She says gender is performative. That's the key point, which is it's the performance that you do. Okay, and this is why you'll see child drag queens now, or drag queens, drag performers, because their gender is on how they perform, and if they're able to perform a specific role at that moment in time, that is what's going to happen. And so she deconstructs this idea of the basic idea of gender, but she's attacking the biological basis of it as well. And this will go into the whole transgender movement as well as we go along this. And she talks about the fact that the male and female categories have been thrown in there to create a matrix through which patriarchy is defended and upheld and really embedded within societies. And we need to identify that and call it out and just deconstruct the whole thing. So you're talking about, we're talking about a war, we're not talking about struggle, we're talking about a very vigorous movement to make sure that their philosophical positioning, which is postmodernism, is led to its most obvious conclusions. And this is an image, look, the UN Women's Council, standing on the shoulders of giants. This is one of the giants, and she says masculine and feminine roles are not biologically fixed, but socially constructed. That encapsulates what she's saying. Who's promoting it? This is the point. I'm saying the UN Commission on Women's Rights, which is basically a body that dictates to, not the West, I mean the West does its own thing, they dictate to developing countries how their aid is used. Do you understand? So they're dictating policies that will have to tie into aid that they're given and support that they're given by NGOs to support their state structures. So it's not just an idea that this is a kind of a side issue. It's very much at the core of where we are. And related to this, that's gender theory, and just in terms of its main kind of waves and where it is. It really very much leads and finishes off at transgender theory and queer theory, which is basically that even this idea of homosexuality is a categorization too far, because there's no such thing as two males in the first place to have a homosexual relationship, or two females to have a, those are the good old days. So when people ask about homosexuality, I'm thinking, oh, I'm so happy. No, it's true. I mean, you get to the point where we are now is we're at queer theory and transgender theory. Queer theory is a complete vagueness in terms of the spread of what gender means. So the other thing that's related to this is truth and morality, because where everything comes into focus for Muslims is that we have, fortunately for us, unfortunately for other people, we have very, very clear definitions of what morality is, what is right and what is wrong. We unashamedly should, and this is the thing I was talking about yesterday, the identity Muslim will jettison this idea that there is such a thing as right and wrong. That you will have Muslim public figures that will openly support the kind of theories that I'm talking about today, because they don't really, deep down I don't think they feel that there is moral truth, or that it's open for discussion, or there's certain things that are open to being tweaked in a public context. But you can't hide your moral values even in a public office. So ethical theory is very important, because we're coming to the point where even whether something can be said to be true or not is a defendable position. So in ethical theory, you have a couple of people that I kind of touched upon yesterday who talk about ethical theory, and they're actually at loggerheads. Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, in terms of their attacks on Islam, are vociferous. They read off from the same page, they repeat the same mantra about Islam. And they're almost as extreme. It's almost as if they're outdoing themselves in terms of their attacks on Islamic civilization. But Sam Harris breaks with Richard Dawkins on the idea of morality, because the big weakness of atheism is the fact that it cannot create a basis for morality. It cannot. It's tried and it cannot. The best it can do, if you take evolutionary biology, the best you can do is say that our moral principles are based upon some kind of evolutionary process. So they're actually, killing, raping, cannibalism, incest is just something biologically inbuilt within us that will maybe at a certain point in the future disappear through the evolutionary process that we are supposedly part of. But Sam Harris is saying, look, if we say that, we've lost. As atheists, we've lost. So he wants to create some kind of basis for morality. And this is important because the basis he creates for objective morality, which is how you decide whether something is correct or something is not, something can be debated or not in the age of feeling, when it comes into conflict with the age of feeling, it will be left. So even his criteria. So his criteria are based upon the fact that we can map out and we can statistically check human flourishing, he talks about, but also well-being. So whatever maximizes your well-being is morally good. So whatever maximizes the moral well-being of the majority of people, the majority of times, is basically what will be given moral objectivity. And it's not philosophical inquiry, it's not scripture, it's not Platonic dialogues of Socrates, it's none of that, it's not Aquinas, it is basically analysis. And what's interesting is, if you take that to its logical conclusion and you ask people what makes you feel good, and you go to America and do this, and this actually, there's a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman, who studied Americans, what makes them happy. And so if you run with Sam Harris's idea of well-being and what makes you feel good. He says they were asked, what gives you pleasure and well-being? Watching TV, talking to friends, and having sex. Okay, that makes people... So in other words, that's morally good. And then he says, what makes them unhappy is commuting, working, looking after children. So, I mean, if you take it to its logical conclusion, Adolf Hitler is just waiting outside. No, that's what I'm saying. I mean, you can joke about it, but where this leads to is very, very interesting. And there's also more pernicious kind of issues here, actually more objective issues, which is he's advocating consequentialism, which is basically that you do what's best for the largest number of people, which sounds perfect. It almost sounds to be like an Islamic perspective on what is ethical as well. So some Muslims might even argue that this is an Islamic perspective. But the way that this is questioned is because there's certain simple experiments that show that human beings never make that decision. So there's this famous tram experiment that people are asked to do. I don't know if you know, you've covered this before, where you've got this train going down this track, and it breaks off into two, and you're in the control of what track it breaks into. On one, there is an individual lying on the ground, unconscious or tied down. On the other, there's 5 or 6 people lying there tied down. So your job is to switch the channel. All the cognitive kind of statistics that we have show that people obviously do what? They don't run away, they don't faint, they will make the conscious decision, the moral decision of preferring the larger number of lives over the lesser. You change that slightly, and this experiment comes up with this idea of you're on a bridge and there's somebody in front of you, and the person in front of you is a means by which you can derail the train. And so you're throwing somebody in front of the train to derail the train, and on the rail track there's only one track, and on the track there's those same 5 or 6 people. The results are completely different in terms of what we do, because you are tubashir, you're actually doing the thing immediately, and you're seeing the immediate result of what you're doing by killing an individual. It's completely different. So consequentialism has a very serious systemic problems, but the most important ones are what I was talking about yesterday, minority and majority. Remember I was talking about yesterday, majority defines what the minority is, and majority always ends up oppressing the minority. The best example of that is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, because it's there to project the maximum benefit for the majority, even if it leads to the complete annihilation of that small minority. And if you look at human history, especially over the previous century, the First World War and the Second World War, and all the kind of philosophical movements, the political movements that came out of that, international socialism, national socialism, they all based their philosophical thinking upon consequentialism. And you can see the Holocaust is one result of that. Is a clear result of consequentialism. So it's not a simple thing of saying what we advocate is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So what about the small number of people, that minority? And remember, we're a minority. Remember, I was talking about the idea of being very careful of this idea of describing ourselves as a minority. So Sam Harris, what he attempts to do is provide a basis for what is right, what's wrong. What I'll come to is the fact that when you have statistical analysis that proves otherwise, he will leave that aside. The thing that he said was objective, worthy of being defended and argued for and fought for as a moral truth. And it gives you, what he's trying to do is create identity for the West. Remember, this is what he's trying to do. He knows that the West, it's always defined vis-a-vis Islam. Even he defines it vis-a-vis Islam. Unless he gives it some kind of backbone, it will disappear, as this is civilization. And he's also arguing against, Richard Dawkins, who basically says that, morality is just your DNA and bad luck. If at a certain point we change our ideas on incest or rape or anything that is abhorrent to us at this moment in time, if we change that as a species, it will become morally good. And I've seen him on record saying as much on incest, on any moral category, because that's where it leads you. So what does he say? He says, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. And he's having a dig at C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis said that God's moral law is the tune to which we dance. So he's having a dig at one of the most important Christian apologists of the last century. The criticisms are very clear that everything has a cause. If you feel a moral impulse, it has to have a cause. Where's the cause? Muslims would say, and Christians would say, and Jews would say, and everyone who's a theist would say, it's inbuilt by God. You have an inherent idea of what is right and what's wrong. And God prescribes that through religious scripture as well. But he'll obviously just say, look, we don't need to have a reason for everything. Well, why is this different from everything else that we discuss and debate? And the other thing is, naturalism, which he's advocating, never tells us why me at this moment in time should adhere to what we've agreed to be moral. So at this moment in time, if you've agreed that, paedophilia is morally obnoxious, why should I, as an individual, adhere to that? And if you read studies on the thinking of paedophiles who have a high IQ, that logic comes in very clearly. So, atheism provides itself as being some kind of, rational system which has no inconsistency. It is full of riddled with inconsistencies. And so remember I was talking yesterday about meta theory. We have to have our own meta theory that replaces this kind of mess that is postmodernism. And where this all comes into being, all that idea of gender theory and the idea of whether morality is objective or subjective, whether we know and it's fixed or whether it's not, is when that ideology of postmodernism comes into conflict with studies, specifically in my context on gender. And this, a couple of examples here. The Supreme Court in America legalized same-sex marriage. So within the discussion, they had expert research commissioned to see whether people who were attracted to the same gender were like that in a sense that it would never change. And basically the position of the Supreme Court and the judges in the Supreme Court was that if this was something that they could not change, then to deny them the right to a family life would be taking away their basic human rights. That makes sense. So it all hinged on this idea: is it innate? Is it something that changes over time or not? And they asked for input from this some of the societies in America dealing with psychology and psychiatry. The American Psychiatric Society, they asked them for input. The input was basically a general consensus among the psychiatrists that it was inbuilt. And it was given as a communique to the Supreme Court. What's interesting is that there is substantive research done on this topic by very prominent universities that are actually not some kind of Catholic, kind of institution which is there paid to do this. This is, the research that is done through peer-reviewed journals, which shows the complete opposite. What it shows is that people that have a same-sex attraction at a certain point, this is a study done between the age of 16 and 22, the majority of them that indicate that within that period of time over a longitudinal study, which is basically looking at them at different phases between 16 and 22, the majority of them change. So the basis of the Supreme Court ruling was that it's inedible, it's unchangeable, and this is the basis for giving people the right to a family life who want a same-sex marriage. And so they interviewed not a small number, but 12,000 people. And this is Cornell University. It's not some kind of, university you have to kind of make up. It's not in East London. It's not one of these places that it's like a front to get. It's not a front to get visas. So what did it say? This is from the study itself, the conclusion. They say, although the stability of sexual orientation components over time was relatively high, stability, in other words, people attracted to something remain stable. Like if you're attracted to a male, you remain attracted to a male. If you're attracted as a male to a female, it remains stable. They're saying, although the stability of sexual orientation components over time was relatively high, And there was statistically, well, there's 12,000 people. The kind of result was very stable. There wasn't people like changing all the time. That stability was due to opposite sex attraction and behavior. And there was the people that were attracted to the opposite gender remained attracted. And because they were a higher population, that remained the same. And then they come up with something which is out there and needs to be analysed by people that study this area, is the instability of same-sex romantic attraction behaviour plus sexual identity in previous investigations presents a dilemma for sex researchers. Dilemma, why? Because they're saying the complete opposite, which is, their kind of submissions to the Supreme Court when they were discussing same-sex marriage was all based upon the complete opposite of this is peer-reviewed, and it's been ingrained and embedded in previous studies and also later on. What does he say? They say presents a dilemma for sex researchers who portray non-heterosexual sexuality as a stable trait of individuals. Okay, so that's the complete opposite of what the Supreme Court was given. Not that they decided that this is true; they were given that. They took it on face value. So examples of study of the kind of questions. 17-year-old males were asked if they had an attraction to another male or female in the past year. 1.5% reported only having romantic attractions to other males. Okay. Now 5 years later, the same. We're talking about like for like. Are they changing? The 1.5%. So this 1.5% of the 12,000. So you're saying out of that, that's the number of people who registered this attraction. So 5 years later, the 1.5% were asked about their attraction since last interviewed, and 70% reported a change in their sexual attraction. So you're talking about that stability. That stability is because of the stability of same-sex or opposite sex attraction. They now only had feelings for women, those males. And so the conclusion you come to is this: the introduction of punitive legislation means that the empirical argument is lost. If you have empirical arguments for a specific position and it clashes with this postmodernist worldview, it will be rejected. The next step is also law enforcement as well, punitive action. And this is, in Birmingham, I think that's where you're going in terms of, the kind of situation that's there. In the transgender context, it's even more complex. Because remember I was talking about Judith Butler and her idea of even biology is constructed. You have this idea of queering. So it's not just about people cross-dressing, it's not just people that feel a desire to imitate the opposite gender. And it's mostly males that have this issue. Previously, even very recently, even until now, there's a whole debate whether this is treated as a mental health issue in terms of being kind of some kind of dysphoria, which is this confusion over identity that afflicts mostly males, and mostly white, mostly middle class. That's the research. It's very much about, it's a specific category of white males that have this dysphoria within them. And so what you find is supporting this idea that it's a mental health issue is the high suicide rate. And this is what's, I know for Muslims it's very important that we don't, in the whole issue of gender and homosexuality and transgender, we don't conflate two things. One is having compassion and understanding for a specific situation a person feels themselves to be in. Okay, so that is a given and it's a non-negotiable that a Muslim should always be. I was talking about yesterday, the reason I mentioned وَإِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ حَوْنًا, that verse, that the servants of the Rahman are the ones that walk meekly in the earth, is that you have to manifest mercy in all your dealings with everybody, even people that do things that you don't agree with in terms of morality. Okay? And that means from a Muslim perspective, you should look at these people with the eye of compassion. You should also look at what you can do to help them as well. And what comes out is, statistics, 20 times more likely to commit suicide. People that have dysphoria are of that nature. But the issue here is about them reconstructing their identity, which is a completely different thing. So what you have is an impasse here, which is you either take them on face value and they say, well, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. And if you're thinking of that, you're saying, no, that's not right because you're not even a man, because you've deconstructed that. And you shouldn't be transitioning to a woman because that is also a male, that's a patriarchal construct. This is the way, this is why Judith Butler's ideas are very much building on sand, because it doesn't make any sense. So what a lot of people then start to say is it's a theory of being queer or queered. Queered was a negative word. They've taken it on as being a definition of this kind of ambiguity and fluidity of gender. So you have binary, which is male, female, and then you have cis-binary, which is specifically to male, female, and then they have non-binary, which is the fact that you have other. So when you identify, you either don't want to say what you are, or more importantly, you want to say that I reject the structural oppression of patriarchy in those two boxes. When you fill in any form, male or female, I was filling up an application for a driving license, and I had a good giggle when I was ticking off, because I thought, I don't think they realise what they're doing here. They're entrenching patriarchy through government structures. I should write to them. Do you understand? Like when you read this kind of stuff, you lose the plot slightly. And so, is it an issue of construction? If it is, do we pander to that? Do we pander to people that say, look, I'm this? In other words, do we pander to their feeling? Okay, where does that lead us in terms of pandering to what people feel is right and what's wrong? On the other hand, if it is a mental health issue, to what degree do you pander to that, or do you address it as being a health issue in which you can actually deal with it and try and come to some conclusion over what it is? And this leads on not just to males, doesn't just lead on to the discussion of males that are transitioning to females and vice versa. It goes into this issue of minors as well, young people, pre-adolescent. And all the empirical evidence here is conclusive. It's not, that's why I'm saying when it comes into conflict with postmodernism and the deconstruction of gender, they don't want to listen. So the studies that we have is 85% return to, this is minors, return to a normal sense of gender. If they're saying, the boy comes home and says, I want to play with Barbie, this kind of constructs that are there anyway, but I'm a girl, or this and that. If consistently contradicted, in other words, by their peers, their families, 85% of them move out of that. It's a phase. It's the complexity of being a child. If you speak to a child, there's some weird stuff going on there, in terms of what actually is happening and who's in the room and all the rest of it. They might see things we don't, but it is a weird realm of existence. 98% return to a normal sense of gender by the age of 25 if consistently, again, contradicted. In other words, this is something to do with perception. It's to do with a mental health issue, which is diagnosed through a specific intervention, which here is consistently contradicted. Imagine a society where you encourage them to flourish at the age of 4. Like, imagine you've got that large percentage, and you allow them, and then you start giving them hormone therapy, and you say, well, by the age of 7, we can have some kind of, we can take this a bit further, and we can have some kind of, and the parents are supporting, because the feelings of the parents or the child are so loving and all the rest of it, and they'll take them to all the functions dressed in a different kind of, even though in Islam we don't really necessarily have, clothing in that way at that age, but they will capitulate to that feeling that the child has. So it's the child. And this is one of the aspects of, أَنْتَلِدَ الْأَمَةَ رَبَّتَهَا, the Prophet said that the woman will give birth to her mistress. It's the child, that's the evilest manifestation of that the child is leading its parents on ideology, the child on thought, on philosophical outlook. That's how weird it gets. Anyway, I don't know, go into that kind of discussion. So the gender crusade is the next thing. This is where it gets a bit more serious, which is, if it was okay if they wanted to transition and be queer and all these kind of things, but the issue here is more about the fact that if you don't buy into this, we're coming out to get you. So there's a study done by Natasha Kennedy and Mark Helen, which I was reading this paper, Experiences of Transgender Children, published in 2010. So there's 2 authors from the same university, I think, Goldsmith in London. So they both wrote this, and I thought nothing of it until I realized that one of the authors and this is where it gets confusing, is part of a private WhatsApp group which was made public, in which it, meaning she or he, I'm not sure which one it is yet, outed and went after individuals that were questioning transgender theory in academia, professors saying, look, there is such a thing as a woman. We've fought for women's rights for so long, we do exist. And so, what's interesting about this is that Natasha Kennedy and Mark Helen are the same person, in the same university, holding two different posts. So, Natasha Kennedy is a trans woman, in other words, a natal man who transitioned into a woman. Mark Helen is the male manifestation of that, both employed by the same university, who co-authored an article on experiences of transgender children. That'd be fine, except for the fact that they have a crusade against people that are saying, what are you doing? So, it leads him to this conclusion: gender self-identification is in reality killing the ideology that gave rise to it. You know, the whole idea of feminism, the suffragettes, and Germaine Greer, and all these people that made very pertinent points about gender. They're the people that are being non-platformed now in terms of university. Germaine Greer's been non-platformed, the Australian feminist. She's not allowed into university. I'm sure she went to Cambridge and she wasn't allowed to speak. Because she said, look, women have fought so long for the rights that they have, just to be taken away by males that feel that they're females and encroach upon our space. And why is that such a difficult thing to understand? It comes down to this idea, for me it comes down to this crux of where it ties into our idea, because that's there, but Muslims are very much capitulating to this. So that postmodern Muslim identity, not of the scriptural, ethical, moral identity, but of the identity as a political group or an ethnic group. Yeah, so you had this march, the Pride March in one of the cities in Britain. And because this whole controversy with Muslim schools, they had the audacity to have it led by Muslims, identity Muslims. You understand? So the point is, it's a very offensive meaning aggressive movement. And there's so many schisms within it that it is going to implode. But the unfortunate thing for this is that Muslims are co-opting themselves with alliances, with people, short-term alliances that are created because they think, well, these are minorities and we are minorities. That minority is going to take away your scriptural identity. So you will be like the atheist Jew who's a Zionist. So your identity will essentially be that your ethnic background is that you have a Muslim name and you go to Eid and you kind of go to the Eid fest and all the rest of it. But essentially there's no moral fabric or teaching there from Scripture. And it comes into this important thing which I'm going to finish off with, which is, you've all heard of Black Lives Matter. Now Black Lives Matter it pushes all the right buttons because it is highlighting, or it's one of the organizations that highlights structural racism, which is an absolute reality and has always been a reality in America and also in other parts of the world. But the interesting about this movement, which is why you always have to think about where movements come from, is that the movement is there and it ties in exactly with this postmodernist deconstructionism. At the very core of Black Lives Matter is this idea that black empowerment has to start. And this is, I think they've taken it off their website now, because it starts with the deconstruction of the gendered family unit. In other words, the male, the female, the husband, the wife. Because that's an oppression, that's a structural oppression that they have. So what do they have? Some of their kind of aims are fostering a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, black liberation movements in this country. We create space, leadership mostly for black, heterosexual, cisgender men. So this is what they said was the past. Martin Luther King, they're all black, they're all heterosexual. We want to get rid of that. We want to make space for queers, transgender, and others, either out of the movement or in the background, to move move the work forward with little or no recognition. So they have this idea that We want to change the way that even race is pushed, addressed. And this is why, when you question not the fact that they're fighting racism, but that you question this philosophical underpinning of it, you will be lambasted and criticized and outed. When you say, for example, look, we need to strengthen the black American family, we need to make sure that we're doing enough to fight the weakness within black American societies as well, you'll be lambasted because you'll be told, look, you're going against the agenda that's here. So also they say that we have committed to disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family and structures requirements by supporting each other as extended families and villages. So this whole collective deconstruction that's there is very much at the core of what they think. So this kind of summary that I've given today is very much about the issue of identity interfacing with the rise of individualism, interfacing with this idea of gender, and then you see all of the cracks within the Western narrative appearing. This idea of, objectivity, of identity, all this dissipates and disappears when you look at that. And on this issue of gender, it's all creating a perfect storm, where the lack of capitulation from Muslims and the fact that they will not just acquiesce and give in to what they're told to do will mean that they will be identified as the minority. And then the majority will take it upon themselves to take punitive action against them. So that is the kind of natural movement of this. So they basically will be saying, unless you play the game in terms of the rules that we have, just remember that you are the minority and we define ourselves vis-a-vis you. And history in terms of minorities, that's the thing. The thing I was talking about, the quote by Nandi at the beginning, the fact that a society is tolerant doesn't necessitate that it remains tolerant when it deals with other people. So Jazakallah khair, that presentation was just to get you to think. This is a morning session, enough to mull over in your minds, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.